Hey there, welcome back to Brad's Labs. Today we're going to go back to the American frontier. The American frontier, or the name it wanted to be called in high school, because it made it feel dark, it made it feel edgy, Wild West, is a time period you've probably heard about. You probably have images that pop to your mind when I say Wild West. Old Western movies, video games like Red Dead Redemption,
You're alright, boy.
books like Little House on the Prairie, the best representation of the Wild West to this day, Wild Wild West. But all of these have a common issue with them, except for the Little House on the Prairie books. They all tend to focus on men. What were the events that led up to, the American frontier, the Wild West? Well, like most things in American history, it really only boiled down to two things: money and the hatred of others. People wanted to find their riches, so they pushed out west, and anybody that got in their way could just be dealt with by lead. And they used a lot of violence to get to where they were at. The westward expansion by the newly founded United States, and I say newly founded, they were still really young at this point in time, only led to conflict with the already established native peoples that were living there. But amongst all the bloodshed, all the agony, women seen a market that needed to be filled, and they chose that they were going to fill it. So let's go ahead and get into today's topic of time travel. This was suggested by Crappy Assassin over on my Patreon, and we're going to shorten that name to Cass from here on because Crappy Assassin just kind of a mouthful. Cass really didn't want a whole lot. They asked to be 23, unwed, and they wanted to start somewhere on the East Coast. So this kind of left me a lot of room to expand their story. So when we're talking about the Wild West, there are some words that will come up that can't be used on YouTube anymore. They are age-restricting videos, so I'm going to have to get a little inventive with some of the words. So when I talk about the world's oldest profession, I'm going to just simply refer to it as red light. With representations of the American West today, there are some large problems when it comes to representation. Oftentimes, minorities are just overlooked, or if they are talked about, they're just kind of shoehorned in to take in, meet a quota or to fill a part of a story. Women are a large part of this. Oftentimes, when you take and think of a woman in the American West, you either think of somebody that worked in the red light that was, to be avoided because you're a good God-fearing man, or they were somebody that was meant to be subservient. And this is a large problem with the way that we do view the American West. Women wanted all the same things that the men that were moving out west wanted. They wanted that life of freedom. They wanted those riches. When Cass made this suggestion to go back to the American frontier, they didn't really have anywhere they wanted to go. So I got to choose, and that was a poor mistake. Being from Kansas, I'm a little bit biased, so I chose to send her back to Kansas. Simply enough, Kansas back then and even now doesn't really have much going for it. We're flat, prairies, but back then the one thing that they did have going were cattle drives. The cattle would be driven from Texas up to Kansas, dispersed out to the rest of the continent from there. And this made it to where a lot of people came flooding into Kansas to capitalize on this cattle drive. Towns started popping up so that the train could come through and load cattle up on them and take them out to the other parts of the continent that actually mattered. So that's where we're going to send Cass back to. So if I were to ask you, what cities do you know in Kansas? You're probably going to respond with, there's actually people that live in Kansas. So I'm going to go ahead and ask another question. What cities do you know from the Wild West? The first answer that pops into your mind is probably Dodge City. But the new Pacific Railroad was coming through, and new towns were actually popping up all over the place. Dodge City came relatively late in that game. And one of these new towns that have popped up due to the cattle drives is where we find Cass. She's 23 and she's living in Abilene, Kansas. But what brought her to that point? She was born in 1853 on the East Coast like many of her time. She was born in Pennsylvania, and factories had already been well established. So she would have spent most of her life working in a factory. But there was another event that happened during her childhood that would have really radically shaped the way that she's seen the world, and that was the American Civil War. It broke out in 1861, so by the time she became an adult, the war had already happened, the country had split, came back together, and now there was this drive westward to take and get your riches. The year is 1874, and Cass decides, I'm going to head out west. I'm going to see what's out there for me. She spends a couple years scraping and saving just so she can get enough money to get some kind of transport out west. and she finally gets enough money in 1876 to buy a train ticket to get to Abilene, Kansas. This train ticket would have cost her about $25, which adjusted for today's inflation is around $700. So it was not cheap, and this was not a comfortable trip. But compared to the wagon, which would have taken her a couple months, this only took her a few days. So yeah, it's not comfortable, but compared to the alternative, it's a much better choice. Cass arrives in Abilene, and unfortunately for her, she missed the boom years for the town. This isn't saying the town isn't growing, the population's around 900, and it is still continuing to grow. But most of the cattle drives have moved on to other towns. There's still cattle drives that come through, but they're not as large, they're not as glorious as they used to be. So this means that she only has a few options ahead of her, and for an unmarried woman, this actually limited her quite a bit to what she was able to do. The first option she has ahead of her is to get married. This kind of sucks because she was expected to have as many kids as she could, take care of the kids, so if they got sick, take care of them, teach them how to read and write. Then she was expected to take care of the house, so do all the cooking, do all the cleaning. If any clothes needed to be made, she had to hand make them, often making the cloth itself by hand. She would have to take and tend to the garden. If there was any food preparation that needed to be done for the winter, that was her job. So if they didn't have enough food for the winter, that was on her. She would have to take and help with any of the farm duties or the ranch duties. So all of this compiled just really sucked and did not appeal to her. The second option she had to her was become a red light worker, and there was no shame in this. The West was quite literally built on the backs of women. When men started moving out west, women seen a void and they knew how to fill it. So they moved out west and they started opening up houses of ill repute. And these houses of ill repute were actually integral parts to helping develop these communities. The madams of these houses often would take people in if they needed food or if they needed shelter. So they were a very large part of actually building up the towns. By the time that she arrives in Abilene, this is already pretty much dried up. They had already implemented hefty fines to take and punish people that either partook or practiced this profession. So this meant that she had to move again if she wanted to do this. She could go to Dodge City, but she's already spent all of her life savings just to get here. So she decides she's going to stay. The last option she has ahead of her is to go into show business. She could either play an instrument, play cards, or go to the rodeo. And she decides that's what she wants to do. She doesn't know how to play cards or an instrument. She knows how to ride a horse. This would have been a brutal life, many broken bones. But at the end of the day, she chose this, she wanted this, and this was how she was going to achieve her freedom and get her riches. Cass's life expectancy was actually pretty good. It was around 60. And this was only because she made it to the age of 20. When she was born, her life expectancy was only 45. So by making it to 20, it gave her a little bit of extra time. Now, life in the rodeo probably shortened that back down to 45. And if that didn't do it, diseases, tuberculosis and smallpox ran rampant. So the rodeo didn't kill her, one of those very well might have. Guns were actually very heavily regulated compared to what they are today in the States. Most towns actually prevented people from being able to carry weapons into the town unless they were lawmen. A study of the 5 major cow towns from Kansas by historian Robert Dykstra actually found that between the years of 1870 and 1885, there were only 45 murders. The only reason that the murders seemed so high was because these towns' populations were quite low, so it actually made the murders look like they were bigger. Why are we so enamored with the West? Simply enough, it captures our imagination. We want to see ourselves out there doing this stuff. We want to see ourselves doing things that we can't do to this day. And we often look at it through rose-tinted glasses. We often see it as being this lawless place where people stood up and there was the underdog. But in the grand scheme of things, it only lasted for 50 years. In comparison, the golden age of piracy lasted for 76. Thank you all for watching. I want to thank the patrons. I want to thank Crappy Assassin for submitting this one. I hope you guys do have a wonderful day, and I hope it's full of prairie dogs and fresh air.